I begin to read the abstract, and then I go on. So Spinoza's ontology is evidently an ontology of positivity. However, there are a certain number of negative statements in the ethics. For example, it is not it is never we who affirm or deny something about the thing, but the thing itself which affirms or denies something about itself in us. It is in the KV. Or we do not desire something because we judge it to be good, but on the contrary, we judge something to be good because we strive toward it, want it, seek it, and desire it. Ethics 3 and P9. In all these statements, Spinoza strives to set nature straight. Indeed, what we say about he says all these statements invert nature. Spinoza restores the order of nature by proceeding with inversion of inversions. He, therefore, properly speaking, resorts to negation of negations. Contrary to what Hegel asserts, Spinoza's work is not devoid of this dimension. Hegel indeed affirms that Spinoza's philosophy is a grandiose but dead philosophy, without becoming, because if every determination is negation, negation is not negation negating itself. If we follow Hegel, these statements where Spinoza sets nature straight would in reality be affirmations, in the sense that a negation of negation is an affirmation, but they would produce nothing. Spinoza would content himself with putting philosophy, which was standing on its head, back on its legs. But by setting nature straight, Spinoza does not content himself with simply returning to an initial affirmation. He opens up a process of liberation. Indeed, through this setting nature straight, we move from a knowledge of the first kind to a knowledge of the second kind. If the inversion carried out by Spinoza consists in substituting understanding for imagination, then it is an inversion that produces something new. It is therefore a negation of negation that is not sterile but fruitful. It opens up new path and new direction for the conatus. Thus, I propose to examine whether Spinoza's philosophy can be considered a negation of negation, and to what extent this negation of negation can be conceived as negativity. And in this presentation, I will focus on one specific case, the issue of decision. I will show that in Spinoza, it is not the subject who takes a decision, it is the decision that constitutes the subject. We will see that the inversion, which is a negation of negation, produces a new conception of subjectivity. So I will I will give my interpretation of the prologue of the TIE, and I will show that it can be seen as a negation of negation. The I, speaking in the first person in the prologue of the TIE, is a unique occurrence in Spinoza's work. Spinoza often expresses himself in his own name in the Ethics and in the treatise, but he never again resorts to this rhetorical device of first-person narration. Some commentators have interpreted this as a sign that at the time of the TIE, Spinoza has not yet developed his critique of free will, and see in these pages the account of a voluntary decision. A whole line of translators and commentators, following Alexandre Coéré in this translation of deliberare in terms of commitment, understand the decision recounted as a voluntary decision and assume that at the time of writing the TIE, Spinoza is still influenced by a Cartesian conception of subjectivity. Contrary to this view, I would like to show that the decision recounted is not a voluntary decision, but a wholly rational one, that the proemium is a demonstration of the failure of the voluntary decision, and that this failure is accompanied by a process of desubjectivation, and that it is the negation of a certain kind of subject that we propose to call the subject cause, and that by this negation, Spinoza proceeds with a negation of an inversion. I hope it is clear. That is to say, a negation of negation. So I will remain the 4 stages of the proemium. It is the proemium. It is the narrative of a decision-making process. 4 stages make up this process. The first one considers the certain good provided by common life, wealth, honor, and pleasure on one side, and this supreme but uncertain good on the other. Things thus initially present themselves in the form of an alternative, either pleasure, honors, and wealth, or good. The observation that Spinoza makes is indeed that the 2 options are incompatible, for the 3 goods proper to common life so distract the mind that it is impossible to seriously apply oneself to something new. However, these 3 objects are most of the time considered by people as goods. The author, the narrator, is thus faced with a dilemma. These 2 types of goods being mutually exclusive, a choice must be made, and therefore it is necessary to renounce. However, Spinoza continues by informing the reader that he has often tried to reconcile the 2, but in vain. In other words, his desire cannot be determined for one on the other object. It is always stretched towards both at the same time. At the end of the first stage, the decision is therefore impossible to make. The 3 goods, although clearly identified as obstacles to thought, are certain, while the supreme good is uncertain. Faced with the impossibility of reconciling the supreme good and the 3 goods, and the need to renounce either one or the others, Spinoza, the narrator, in the second stage, after having thought about a matter a little, I quote, is forced to introduce the criterion of utility and then discovers that the goods of communal life are not certain, but on the contrary, uncertain by nature. The supreme good, on the other hand, although uncertain as to its attainment, is certain by nature. A first shift then occurs. The certain by nature character begins to weigh more heavily in the balance. It appears more judicious and more useful to renounce what is uncertain by nature. Nevertheless, the decision doesn't impose itself yet, for the 2 terms of the alternative still present themselves as goods. The 3rd stage, initiated by a more assiduous meditation, I quote, sees things reversed. Good, certain as to their attainment, but uncertain by nature, are revealed as certain evils. For it appears upon deeper reflection, if only I could deliberate thoroughly, I quote, that the objects pursued by the crowd are not only of no use in preserving our beings, but often cause our loss. This 3rd stage constitutes the climax of the crisis. The author, like a sick person doomed to a certain death, is forced to seek a remedy, even if it is uncertain. The pursuit of his reflection leads the narrator to understand that unhappiness and happiness depends on the quality of the objects we love. If this object is perishable, we will be unhappy. If this object is imperishable, our soul cannot be troubled. We would thus expect at this stage of the itinerary that the author of these lines renounces a now known evil and turns resolutely towards the certain good. But clear perception is not enough. In the fourth stage, far from resolving the crisis, begins with the observation of a failure. Indeed, as clearly as my mind perceived this, I could not, however, totally divest myself from greed, pleasure, and glory. If clear knowledge is not enough, what more is needed? This is the nodal point of the entire prologue lies, and where the translation of the verb deliberare proves decisive. Just as he returned to the constituitandem, Spinoza takes up the formula of paragraph 7, which initiated the search modo possim penitus deliberare at the beginning of this fourth stage. I quote, "In truth, it is not without reason that I have used these words, if only I could deliberate thoroughly. Modo possim serio deliberare." The primary sense of deliberare is to reflect deeply, deliberate. But the verb can also mean to make a decision. It has both a theoretical and practical meaning. Since the term is ambiguous, some translators have chosen to translate it with the transparent term, in English, deliberate. However, it is necessary to propose an interpretation. Some commentators translate it as reflect, for example, Moreau, Zwerman, but others are commit fully. This is the case with Coiré, who proposed in 1964, in this translation of the TIE, to translate penitus deliberare and serio deliberare as provided that I can commit fully. En français, m'engager à fond. And Edwin Curley chooses to follow Coiré and justifies this choice as follows. He says, I follow Coiré in thinking that to be the meaning here. When Spinoza comments on this phrase in paragraph 10, it seems clear that he thinks of his difficulty as more volitional than intellectual. This choice of translation is also adopted by Michel Bessade in the recent French edition of the complete works. She translates penitus deliberare as commit fully and serio deliberare as commit seriously, m'engager à fond, m'engager sérieusement. This choice is laden with meaning. The notion of commitment indeed inclines towards the idea of voluntary decision. In this introduction to the TIE in the French edition of the complete works, Filippo Minini assumes an underlying theory of the will in Spinoza at that time. He sees it as an argument to justify his proposal to reverse the order of writing between the TIE and the short treatise. Also, I am entirely convinced that the TIE is Spinoza's first work. I do not subscribe to this interpretation. On the contrary, I believe that nothing justifies such an assumption. I believe that nothing allows us to suppose that at that time Spinoza would still be dependent on the Cartesian conception of will. I propose to interpret the prologue as the account of a non-voluntary decision. Furthermore, I propose to read the itinerary as the staging of the failure of the traditional conception of will and subjectivity. I think it's too long. Okay. Okay. So I will show that there is a fail. It is the failure of the will. Firstly, things are formulated in terms of will in the initial stage. We can in this notice the presence of Vele in paragraph 2. The narrator wants Willem to seriously apply himself to another new thing. But this would be to desire something uncertain. The initial movement or impulse is therefore a will. Also, in paragraph 2, things are presented in the form on an alternative, a classic scheme of the voluntary conception of decision-making. Two paths present themselves. On one side, the advantages of honor and wealth, on the other, another new thing. But far from appearing as a situation of freedom, in which the will could freely self-determine, the will is immediately confronted with its powerlessness, and far from being free, it stumbles upon a necessity. The two branches of the alternative are indeed exclusive of each other, because the narrator tells us that he has often tried to reconcile the two in vain. The narrator would like not to have to choose, not to renounce, but he is forced to. The first stage thus presents a first failure of the will. Therefore, a choice would have to be made, but precisely the choice is not made. On the contrary, the passage to the second stage is the result of a second constraint. Faced with the irreducible incompatibility of the two branches of the alternative, the narrator is compelled to seek what is most useful to him. But the choice cannot yet be made, because if the three goods of common life are not known to be uncertain, they still appear as goods. A third constraint intervened in the third stage, with the dramatization and the figure of a sick person suffering from a deadly disease, forced to seek a remedy. Therefore, we see that in these three first moments, if we consider the will as the subject of this journey, it is to observe its successive failures. For it is, on the contrary, reflection, which we have just seen, it's at each stage the understanding of a necessity that is at work. The will has indeed disappeared. We witness the almost extinction of the I that desires. It reappears in paragraph 6 in a repetition of paragraph 2. It seems it did, I have said, to want to lose a certain good, but the I speaking is from the second stage onward, an I that sees, that perceives, that meditates, and that under the influence of this reflection is constrained. But even here, the choice cannot be made. At the threshold of the fourth stage, reflection alone is no longer sufficient to necessarily cause a change. The narrator knows what must be sought with all his strength, but as clearly as his mind perceives that it can completely shed, déponere, great pleasure and glory. But it is not the will that, rising from its ashes, finally decides to renounce them completely. In this moment, the will shines, on the contrary, by his absence. The entire classical model of voluntary decision-making is ultimately invalidated. For the end of paragraph 11 shows us that it was by no means a matter of reconciling the two goods of common life. The itinerary ends, in fact, with the discovery that the three goods of common life can, on the contrary, be very useful, insofar as they are considered as means. In other words, the initial presentation in the form on an alternative and necessary renunciation was a pure representation, which we now discover to be false. The very idea of conflict between contrary desires, which is the starting point, turns out to be an artifice. For there was no battle. The desire for the good of common life was not overcome, but on the contrary, gradually reintegrated as means. It is as if in this retrospective staging of the itinerary, Spinoza began by presenting things in an inadequate configuration to progressively show its ineffectiveness, and then finally to reveal in this unexpected denouement another idea of decision, a rational decision. Indeed, we can observe that only thought is operative. There is indeed a subject speaking in the first person, who is the subject of the decision, but the decision is made through reflection without the individual intervening in this process through a voluntary act. Reflection alone is at work. The itinerary is indeed punctuated by expressions that attest to a process of understanding and only understanding. The tone is set from the first step, when Spinoza specifies, here is the question what I was pondering in my soul, volvebam igitur animo. In the second step, he has pondered the question, aliquandum ui crei incubueram. And the result of this reflection takes the form of a deduction, as we can clearly conclude from what has been said. Ut clare ex dictus possumus colligere. Then the process advances further in the third phase through an assiduous meditation, assidua meditatione. Thought becomes increasingly clear, reaching its maximum tension at the threshold of the first step. So clearly that my mind perceived this, quanvis mente adeo perciperem. We therefore witness a crescendo of understanding at increasingly intense levels of reflection and clarity. Finally, it is through knowledge, through the progressive knowledge of true goods, and the discovery of the usefulness of goods in common life as means that the crisis is resolved. We can, the more the narrator succeeds in thinking, the less he is a personal subject. So I propose to call the proemium a process without a subject. After the resolution of the crisis, that is at the end of the paragraph 11, the I of the experience gives way to another I, the I of the author of the treatise. For the first sentence of the paragraph 12, the tone changes. There is a continuous shift from the I of the singular individual recounting a unique experience to the I of the author explaining what he means by true goods and supreme good. The tone of the exposition regarding these notions until the end of paragraph 13 is very didactic. It should be noted, will be said, is called with the author, we, referring to the following, especially when we know, etc. On the other hand, the present tense succeeds the past tense that was used in the first 11 paragraphs. Theos Verman has shown this very well in this commentary. And he says, the narrative genre gives way to the didactic and categorical genre. He sees from the second sentence of paragraph 10 a sudden transition from an, I quote, anthropological and ethical narrative to an ontological exposition, in which the first person singular gives way to an unpersonal or super-personal discourse, end of quote. In other words, in Althusser's category, an ideological discourse in which the subject is central is succeeded by a scientific discourse, which is characterized precisely by the absence of the subject. Indeed, it is the philosopher Spinoza who inserts himself into the first-person narrative to briefly resume it later. The philosophical or scientific discourse is thus characterized by the disappearance of the I of the experience in the first person. The I of the narrator reappears in paragraph 14, but it takes on a significantly different character after this didactic, philosophical, or scientific exposition. The I that states the goal towards which it now tends is no longer quite the same as the narrative in the past tense. It now expresses itself in the present, which here is the time of certainty. Certainty regarding the nature of the goal. So we can observe a double paradoxical process of solidification on the one hand of this I and desubjectivation on the other. It is as if the process of liberation and access to truth necessarily accompanies a depersonalization and the personalizing of the narrative goes. It is as if the personalizing of the narrative goes hand in hand with the powerlessness and alienation of the subject. It's very striking to see that the staging is precisely the staging of powerlessness. The only text in which Spinoza or a narrator expresses himself from a single point of view is a text which is the point of view of an alienation. The more the narrator suffers, the more he appears in his subjectivity. Conversely, the more he gains in certainty, the more he expresses himself in a dialectic and objective manner. It thus seems that the certitude of this subject, the certitude necessarily accompanies a movement of desubjectivation. In the rest of the treatise, this depersonalization reaches its climax with the spiritual automaton, automa spirituale. Indeed, the order of understanding according to which the mind, like a spiritual automaton, links its idea according to determined laws, is the object order of all understanding. Nothing is more impersonal, in fact, than truth. Imagination is indeed much more inventive and creative than understanding. The mind is a spiritual automaton only insofar as it breaks with all personal experience. The idea of the spiritual automaton implies objectivity and universality. It is a thinking machine common to all humans, which provides an understanding of the world as it is, rather than as each individual understands it, based on their own nature. So the spiritual automaton's function is to perform a double refutation, that of theory of mind as subject and that of free will. In the Ethics, things get worse at the mind is no longer, as in the treatise of the reform of the understanding, as instance that has emerged from I animus. In the Ethics, just we see man thinks, axiom 2 of the second part. Thought is immediately desubjectivized and, as we have seen, universalized. when a mind thinks, it is actually God who thinks. According to proposition 1 of the second part, God is the thinking thing. Once the mind is trapped, where Descartes starts from the cogito, that is the thinking substance, Spinoza identifies the thinking thing with God himself. The gesture is radical. Man thinks according to definition 2, but it is not the subject of his thought, for his thought does not proceed from him, but from God. It is the opposite. It is the mind as mode that proceeds from the attribute of thought. This disappearance of the subject had given rise to famous remark by Hegel, who notes in the Science of Logic that the principle of personality is lacking in Spinoza's substance, which he writes in the section dedicated to Spinoza in volume 6 of this lecture on the history of philosophy, can only provoke the indignation of the subject. I quote, "The universal substance of Spinoza incites the revolt of the representation of the subject's freedom. For the fact that I am a subject, a spirit, etc. The entirely determined is entirely a modification. That is what is revolting in Spinoza's system and what provokes indignation toward it. For man is conscious of freedom of the spiritual, which is the negative of the corporal, and that it is only in opposition to the corporal that it truly is what it is." End of quote. If God is the thinking thing, should we understand that he is the subject of thought in the corollary of proposition 11 of the second part? We indeed read that when we say that the human soul perceives this or that, we say nothing other than God, not insofar as he is infinite, but insofar as is explained through the nature of the human soul, that is, insofar as he constitutes the essence of the human soul, that is, that idea. We could say, in this case, that it is that if the decision is not the decision of a mind conceived as subject, it is the decision of God. But no, this is precisely what Hegel laments. The absolute in Spinoza is only substance. It is not also subject. Thought is an attribute, and thus, as such, it constitutes the essence of God. God cannot be distinguished from it by being its subject. God is neither subject nor agent. He acts and operates solely according to the necessity of his nature. The thought of God, therefore, in this is absolutely automatic. I referring to automaton spirituale. The subject cause, torn between his desire for a new rule of life and on the one hand, and its desire for the three goods of common life on the other, gives way to the subject effect in the prologue, now directed toward a single end. This end, namely, to acquire such a nature and strive for many others to acquire it with me, is not decreed but constituted, and with it, a subject is now also firmly constituted. Once again, we have seen Spinoza setting nature straight, the individual that we are neither make nor form decisions, rather it is our decisions that form and constitute us. Thank you.